Okay, so at this stage, we are ready to pack our case with acrylic. We've invested our case, separated it, and we have a nice glossy look to the model side and as well as the side where the teeth are invested. And from here on, what we want to do is we want to roughen the teeth, the back side of the teeth, to make sure that we have proper bonding between the acrylic and the teeth themselves. So before we do that though, we can start mixing our acrylic. And keeping in mind that the ratios for mixing acrylic, and this is pretty much right across the board, whether you're using Lucitone 199 or whether you're using Impact 20 or Diamond D, they average anywhere between 2.1 grams to 2.3 grams for every 1 milliliter of liquid. Okay? So in other words, 21 grams per 10 milliliters of liquid. This is weight. The measuring vials that we're going to use are not by weight, they're by volume. And on the average, you're going to measure out about 40 cubic centimeters of powder per unit on the average. Sometimes you want to go more, closer to 50 or closer to 30, depending on the size of the case. So therefore, if we look at this, these ratios here, the coefficient for these ratios is about 2.5. So therefore, if I'm measuring out 40 cc's, cubic centimeters of powder, I need 16 ml of monomer, according to this. And if you measure out 50, well, you would use the ratio to figure out what your monomer should measure out, okay? The measuring, you can use it with something like this, like a silicone rubber bowl, but I don't think you'll be able to squeeze 80 cubic centimeters of powder in here. You might be able to do one case. It's probably good enough till about maybe 60 or 70 cubic centimeters of powder. So what you can do is find a glass bowl. This is what I like to use, a glass bowl like this. And you also need a lid because we need to cover it once we start mixing it to make sure that we don't have monomer evaporating excessively before the initial stage. Otherwise, we won't have proper polymerization. Okay? So what I've done here, I've measured out 40 grams of powder twice, and I've measured out 16 milliliters of liquid twice. That corresponds with each one. I'm going to introduce the liquid first. So I got 32 milliliters of liquid. I'm going to completely empty the first beaker of powder. And then I'm going to leave out a little bit from the second one. Leave out maybe about 12, 15 cubic centimeters. I like to use the back of my font stock to start mixing this. Looks rather liquidy. And then finish off with the rest of the powder. and it gives me the same consistency all the time. Now, depending how you eyeballed the powder inside the beaker and the liquid, it doesn't take much to be off by a smidge. And I think, just by experience, I think this one here is a little bit on the runny side. So I'm going to add maybe another 2 cubic centimeters of powder. Just that there. So the time this mix will take to get into a doughy stage where we can actually start thinking about packing our acrylic will be about 10 minutes, considering the room temperature where you're working is about 23 degrees Celsius. If it's anything less, obviously we'll extend the time. If it's anything more, it will reduce the time. Wipe off the excess, and I'm going to cover this and come back to it in about 10 minutes. So in about 10 minutes, you should have something that looks something like this, where you can actually squeeze it away or scoop it away in the event that you're using a glass mixing bowl. Put on some gloves. So now that it becomes somewhat doughy, I can remove it and start squeezing it in my hands just to get a bit of a better mix. One thing I failed to mention here, which I kind of do it just by default, make sure that you mix your powder and your liquid for about 30 seconds at least with your spatula. So at this point, I tend to stretch out the material and kind of collapse it upon itself again. Maybe squeeze it. And through years of experience, I like the feel of this now because it's very, very smooth, very even in terms of the consistency. And right about here, just before it becomes snappy, we can start thinking about doing trowel packing. If I'm not doing trowel packing, then I would wait for this to further polymerize a little bit more and become somewhat snappy. It's still stringy, but if I'm not doing trowel packing, where I'm going to overpack the case, I'm going to leave this a little bit more. If you pack a case without doing trowel packing and you pack the acrylic too early, you won't build up enough compression inside the mold and risking of having porosity. Okay, so while this is doing its business, it's going through its various stages to turn to this stage. What we can do, we can start thinking about roughening the back of the teeth. You can use a round burr. You can use any burr that fits the scenario, really. I'm going to use the taper burr that you guys have in your kits and roughen the back of the teeth. Relatively high RPM. Gentle pressure. You notice this tooth here started to move and is coming out of its socket. So I'm just going to pull it out all together and continue to the next one. So depending how much undercut you've exposed on the tooth during your wax up and the quality of your handpiece and your burr, if you create too much vibration, you're going to pull every tooth out of the mold. but try not to. So I'm just going to make my way around. I want to roughen the ridge lap portion of the tooth as much as possible to increase the bonding area between each tooth and the acrylic. So you might want to rotate your case so you don't touch the sides of the stone, because it will alter the finish of your wax up as it turns into acrylic. So I'm going to blow off a little bit of the dust with some gentle air, and then possibly just poke away some of the residue with an instrument and blow that off. Now that little bit in there, the tooth, I'm going to use an instrument. You can use the tip of your number 7 spatula just to drop some separator in there. Not a whole lot. Just a little bit. Maybe a little bit too much there, so I'm just going to move some out. And place the tooth back into position. And try to wedge it back in from the lingual to the buccal. And you can see the excess separator oozing out on the side. So you can just simply wipe it off with a brush, or just use your air nozzle to blow off the excess very carefully. So that's back in there. It's not going to move. So I'm going to move on to the lower and do the same thing. The RPM on your handpiece should be around 25,000 RPM or so. Just make sure that your handpiece is well balanced and you're using a relatively fine burr, not too coarse. Otherwise, it will start creating a lot of vibration like that and possibly removing a lot of teeth out of position. Make my way around. In the event that you have composite resin teeth, you might want to introduce some diatorics on the back of the teeth or some vent holes to ensure that you reach the acrylic layer so you get proper bonding with the tooth. And if you are using composite teeth, you might want to roughen the back of the tooth a little more aggressive than I am with these. These are all acrylic teeth. So I'm going to blow off the little excess there with a fine mist of air. And as you do so, be aware that nothing falls out as it did here. So once again, I'm going to introduce a little bit of separator. Right in there. Reposition my tooth. Just drop it in there somewhere. And then start from the lingual side and wedge it all the way in. And it's always a good idea to take your instrument and just go back and poke every tooth back into position. Make sure nothing has moved. But everything feels pretty good. And I'll do that with the top as well. If you do have little shavings like this, don't worry about it. It will mix with the acrylic and you won't notice it, but take the time to clean it up in case, especially if you have any separator on the back of the teeth. So in this particular case, we didn't have to reduce the ridge lap of the tooth to make it fit when we were setting up the tooth. So there was this glossy layer on the back of the tooth that you need to roughen to get proper bonding between the tooth and the acrylic. But even if you've done it before and it looks rough, you have to understand when you separate the case that there's a fine layer of separator that's on there. And you have to do it anyways. You have to roughen it regardless if you roughen the tooth before or not, because there's going to be a fine layer of separator. So this is ready. This is ready. And now all I have to do is wait for this to get to the right consistency so I can start packing the case.